The snow started before Clara Bennett crossed the Montana state line. Thick slow flakes drifting across the windshield like ash falling through moonlight. By the time the black SUV turned onto the mountain road leading toward Black Hollow Estate, the storm had swallowed the world behind them. Pine trees towered on both sides of the narrow road, their branches heavy with ice, their shadows stretching endlessly into the dark. Clara sat quietly in the back seat, one gloved hand resting against the cold window, as she watched the distant lights of the estate appear through the snowfall. It did not look like a retreat for diplomats. It looked like something older. A fortress buried in the mountains. Stone towers rose against the winter sky, lit by amber torches that flickered through the storm like warning fires. Black iron gates slowly opened ahead of them with a low mechanical groan that echoed through the valley. The driver tightened both hands on the steering wheel. He had barely spoken during the 3-hour drive from Billings, but now his voice broke the silence carefully, almost reluctantly. "Whatever you do," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the road ahead, "do not let the king see you afraid." Clara turned slightly toward him. "That bad?" The driver swallowed once before answering. "People who work here stop asking questions after a while." Then he said nothing else. The SUV rolled forward through the gates. Snow crunched beneath the tires as they entered the massive courtyard. Armed guards lined the outer walls beneath black stone archways, rifles hanging at their sides, their dark coats dusted white with snow. Yet despite the military presence, the atmosphere felt strangely silent. No shouting, no movement, just the sound of wind passing through the old fortress walls. Clara stepped out of the vehicle as freezing air swept around her ankles. Her boots sank slightly into fresh snow while she adjusted the collar of her charcoal coat. Somewhere high above, church bells echoed faintly through the mountains. Another convoy entered the courtyard behind them, headlights cutting through the storm. The guards immediately straightened. Clara expected someone important. A governor, maybe. One of the Alpha Territory leaders. But something strange happened instead. As the second black SUV came to a stop near the castle entrance, every guard lowered their eyes. Not respectfully, fearfully. No one moved toward the vehicle. No one opened the door. The courtyard itself seemed to hold its breath. Clara felt it immediately, the shift in the air. Then the rear passenger door slowly opened. A tall man stepped out into the snow without assistance. Black wool coat, black gloves. Dark hair touched silver beneath the torchlight. He did not look around the courtyard or acknowledge anyone watching him. Yet somehow his silence carried more authority than shouting ever could. Clara understood instantly. Rowan Vale, the Alpha King. Stories about him had followed her all the way from Seattle. Ruthless negotiator, cold strategist, dangerous enough to hold together 5 unstable territories through fear alone. But none of those stories prepared her for the strange loneliness surrounding him now as snow gathered across his shoulders. He stood perfectly still beside the vehicle while the storm moved around him like smoke. The guards remained frozen with lowered eyes. Nobody dared approach him. Then Clara noticed something she was certain no one else had seen. His hands were trembling slightly, barely noticeable beneath the falling snow. A tiny movement hidden inside all that terrifying stillness. Not weakness, exhaustion. The realization unsettled her more than fear would have. Rowan slowly lifted his gaze toward the courtyard. Silver eyes caught the torchlight. For one suspended moment, Clara forgot the freezing air pressing against her lungs. Forgot the storm. Forgot the guards watching from the walls. His expression never changed when his eyes landed on her. But something inside the silence shifted. The wind moved sharply through the courtyard between them, carrying snow across the black stone ground. And Clara suddenly understood why nobody here slept easily. By morning, the storm had buried Black Hollow beneath nearly 2 feet of snow. Frost covered the towering castle windows in pale silver patterns while dark clouds pressed low across the Montana mountains like heavy stone. Clara stood near the edge of the negotiation chamber with a leather folder clutched against her chest, trying to ignore the way conversations stopped whenever she moved through the room. The council gathering had begun before sunrise. Men and women from Alpha territories across Wyoming, Colorado, and northern Idaho filled the long chamber beneath iron chandeliers and candlelight. Expensive wool coats dripped melted snow onto black marble floors while armed security lined the walls in silence. Yet despite the crowd, the room felt strangely restrained. Nobody laughed loudly. Nobody relaxed. Because Rowan Vale sat at the far end of the chamber beneath the crest of the Northern Territories. He had not spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Still, every person in the room watched him carefully between sentences, as though measuring the temperature of something dangerous. Clara noticed the exhaustion again immediately. His silver eyes remained focused on the documents spread before him, but there was tension buried deep beneath his composure now. The kind of exhaustion that settled into someone's bones after too many sleepless nights. A younger negotiator from Denver suddenly approached the head council table, visibly pale. He whispered urgently into the ear of an older woman seated near the center. The woman frowned, then looked toward Clara across the room with unmistakable irritation. "Miss Bennet," she called sharply. Clara stepped forward carefully. "Yes." The older woman adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Holloway has requested reassignment effective immediately." The younger negotiator refused to look at Clara directly while collecting his files. "Family emergency," he muttered too quickly. Nobody believed him. The woman sighed through her nose before continuing. "You will work directly beside His Majesty effective immediately." The chamber fell completely silent. Somewhere behind Clara, someone whispered under their breath, "God help her." Another chair scraped softly against the floor. Clara felt dozens of eyes settle onto her at once. But Rowan never looked up from the documents in front of him. "Understood," Clara answered. Evenly, though her pulse tightened beneath her ribs. The older woman gave a single stiff nod. "The King's private strategy room. 10 o'clock tonight." By the time Clara reached the eastern wing hours later, night had already swallowed the estate again. Snow pressed heavily against the castle windows while distant wind echoed through the stone corridors like low breathing. A young guard escorted her through 2 security checkpoints before stopping outside a pair of dark oak doors. "He is inside," the guard said quietly. Then he left immediately. Clara hesitated before pushing the doors open herself. Warm firelight spilled across the room. She expected assistance. Advisors. Security teams. Instead, she found Rowan alone beside a massive wall-sized map covered in colored pins and handwritten military routes stretching across the Western Territories. His sleeves were rolled neatly to his forearms. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes beneath the candlelight. It was nearly 2 in the morning, yet he still stood there working in silence. Rowan did not appear surprised when she entered. "Miss Bennet." His voice was low, steady. "You are late by 4 minutes." Clara blinked once. "I thought the meeting started at 10. "It did." He finally looked toward her then. "You stopped for coffee downstairs." Clara stared at him, unsettled. He had noticed that? Rowan returned his attention to the map wall, as though reading her thoughts no longer interested him. "Close the door." The room became quieter after she did. Almost too quiet. Clara moved toward the long strategy table stacked with treaty files and handwritten reports. The scent of cedarwood and smoke lingered faintly in the air. As she gathered several folders into her arms, her wrist brushed unexpectedly against shattered glass near the fireplace mantel. Sharp pain flashed across her hand. "Damn!" A thin line of blood appeared across her palm. Before she could react further, Rowan crossed the room. Fast. Silent. His hand closed gently around her wrist. The movement froze the entire atmosphere between them. Clara stopped breathing for a second. Rowan lowered his gaze toward the blood against her skin. His expression never changed. Yet something unreadable flickered behind his silver eyes beneath the firelight. Then quietly, almost tiredly, he said, "Careful." His hand remained around her wrist 1 second longer than necessary. Outside, snow battered against the ancient windows while the fire crackled softly behind them. And Clara suddenly realized she could no longer tell whether Rowan Vale frightened her, or whether she was beginning to feel sorry for him. The storm worsened after midnight. Snow hammered against Black Hollow's towering windows hard enough to rattle the old glass inside their iron frames while freezing wind moaned through the mountain cliffs surrounding the estate. Clara had lost track of how many hours she had spent inside Rowan Vale's strategy room. Treaty maps still covered the long oak table between them, untouched for nearly 20 minutes now. The negotiations themselves had ended hours ago, But Rowan remained standing beside the fireplace reading intelligence reports beneath dim candlelight as though exhaustion simply did not apply to him. Clara sat across from him with a legal pad resting forgotten in her lap. The cut on her hand still stung faintly beneath the bandage she had wrapped around it earlier. She should have gone to bed. Yet something about leaving him alone in that enormous silent room suddenly felt wrong. Rowan closed another report slowly before speaking without looking up. "You should avoid being alone with me after midnight." His voice remained low and controlled, almost emotionless. Clara frowned slightly. "That sounds less reassuring than you probably intended." A flicker moved behind his silver eyes then vanished. "It was not intended to reassure you." Silence settled heavily between them again. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere deep across the mountains. Then without warning, the lights throughout the estate went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. Clara startled upright as the fire became the only remaining source of light inside the chamber. Somewhere far down the corridor, voices echoed briefly before disappearing beneath the storm. Rowan did not move. He simply lifted his gaze toward the windows where snow lashed violently against the glass. "Backup generators will fail in weather like this," he said quietly. "The eastern wing loses heat first." Clara rubbed her hands together instinctively as cold air already began creeping through the ancient stone walls. "That sounds comforting." Rowan finally crossed the room, collecting several candles from a nearby cabinet before lighting them one by one with practiced calm. Warm gold light flickered across the sharp lines of his face, softening him somehow without making him seem less dangerous. If anything, the quiet only made him harder to read. A distant knock interrupted them moments later. One of the estate guards opened the door slightly, snow dusting his shoulders. "Your Majesty, maintenance says the west corridors are blocked. The library is the only room with a functioning fireplace large enough to hold heat overnight." Rowan gave a single nod. "Understood." The guard hesitated briefly before glancing once toward Clara. Then he disappeared again. 10 minutes later they walked through the darkened castle together beneath candlelight and shadow. The estate felt entirely different without electricity. Older. Stranger. Endless hallways stretched through black stone arches while moonlight filtered faintly through narrow windows high above them. Clara could hear the storm breathing through the walls. Rowan walked ahead of her carrying a lantern in one gloved hand, his broad shoulders cutting through the darkness with calm certainty. Neither of them spoke. The library doors finally opened into a vast circular room lined floor to ceiling with towering shelves and iron ladders disappearing into shadow. A massive fireplace burned near the center beneath a painted ceiling covered in faded constellations. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood, parchment, and smoke. Clara stepped farther inside, staring upward. "This place feels haunted." Rowan closed the heavy doors behind them. "It probably is." The answer came so dry and effortless that Clara nearly smiled before catching herself. The temperature continued dropping despite the fire. Clara moved toward one of the far shelves searching for additional candles while cold crept through her coat sleeves. Her fingers trembled slightly. She hated that he could probably notice. Behind her, silence shifted. Then suddenly warmth settled across her shoulders. Clara froze. Rowan had removed his black wool coat and draped it carefully around her from behind. The fabric still carried traces of winter air and cedar smoke. His hand brushed lightly against her shoulder for only a second before disappearing. "Stay near me," he said quietly. Not commanding, not threatening, just certain. Then he walked away toward the fire before she could answer. Clara stood motionless between the towering shelves with his coat wrapped around her shoulders, while snowstorm shadows moved softly across the library walls. And for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow, the silence between them no longer felt entirely dangerous. Morning arrived pale and colorless over Black Hollow. The storm had finally weakened sometime before dawn, leaving the mountains buried beneath heavy snow and silence. Frost clung to the library windows in delicate silver veins, while weak winter sunlight filtered through the glass and settled softly across rows of ancient books. Clara woke slowly in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar room and the faint smell of cedar smoke surrounding her. Then she realized Rowan's black coat was still draped over her shoulders. The fire had burned low overnight. Embers glowed quietly beneath ash while the massive library remained wrapped in stillness. Clara sat upright too quickly, expecting to find herself alone. Instead, Rowan stood near the far window staring out across the snow-covered valley below the estate. His broad shoulders remained perfectly still beneath his dark sweater, one hand resting lightly against the cold stone arch beside him. He looked as though he had not slept at all. Again, Clara studied him silently before speaking. "You could have woken me." Rowan did not turn around immediately. "You looked comfortable." The simple answer unsettled her more than it should have. She rose carefully, folding his coat over one arm before crossing toward the fireplace. "I am beginning to think. Nobody here actually sleeps." A faint shadow crossed Rowan's expression then disappeared. "Sleep is a luxury in places like this." His voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion carefully buried beneath discipline. Later that afternoon, the negotiations resumed inside the Grand Council chamber. Tension filled the room heavier than before. Rival Alpha representatives argued across the long black table, while snow drifted steadily beyond the towering windows overlooking the mountains. Clara sat beside Rowan now instead of across from him, close enough to hear the controlled rhythm of his breathing whenever silence fell between discussions. Colorado representatives demanded expanded territory access. Wyoming delegates threatened withdrawal from the summit entirely. Yet Rowan remained calm through all of it, his silver eyes unreadable beneath the chandelier light. Then one council member accused him directly of sacrificing smaller territories to maintain political stability across the northern regions. The room stiffened instantly. Clara looked toward Rowan, expecting anger. Instead he leaned back slowly in his chair, gaze fixed on the man speaking. "You think power protects people," Rowan said quietly. The chamber fell silent beneath the weight of his voice. He paused for several seconds before continuing. "It only teaches you who gets sacrificed first." Nobody answered him after that. The meeting ended shortly afterward beneath a silence that followed Rowan out of the room like smoke. That night Clara could not sleep. Wind moved softly against the castle walls while distant pipes groaned through the old heating system. She stood near her bedroom window watching snow drift across the dark courtyard below when something pulled her attention toward the eastern wing. A faint sound, barely audible. Clara hesitated before stepping quietly into the corridor. The castle remained dim beneath scattered wall sconces and moonlight. The sound came again as she approached Rowan's chambers. Not shouting, not rage, just uneven breathing, like someone trapped inside a nightmare they could not escape. Clara stopped outside his door, pulse tightening unexpectedly. For several long seconds she simply stood there listening. Then silence returned, complete and heavy. The next morning Rowan appeared inside the council chamber precisely on time, perfectly composed in a black suit and silver tie as though nothing had happened during the night. No visible exhaustion, no weakness, only control. Yet Clara noticed the slight stiffness in his shoulders when he sat beside her, the almost invisible shadows beneath his eyes. During a break between negotiations, she slipped quietly downstairs into the estate kitchens. Most staff members avoided eye contact when she entered. The older cook finally handed her a porcelain cup of hot black tea without asking questions. Steam curled softly into the cold hallway air as Clara carried it through the eastern wing before sunrise. She left the tea outside Rowan's door without knocking. Then she walked away before she could reconsider the decision. Hours later, during another endless negotiation session, Clara entered the council chamber carrying fresh files. She stopped abruptly when she noticed the porcelain cup sitting beside Rowan's chair near the throne platform. Empty, untouched by servants. Rowan never looked toward her while reviewing documents beneath the candlelight. But as Clara slowly took her seat beside him, she realized something quietly dangerous had already begun to change between them. The security threat arrived just after sunset. Snow still blanketed the mountains surrounding Black Hollow, but the skies had finally cleared enough for sharp moonlight to spill across the frozen valley below the estate. Clara stood near the eastern balcony reviewing revised treaty schedules when the first alarms echoed through the castle corridors. Not loud, controlled, deliberate. Guards moved quickly through the halls beneath low emergency lighting while council members gathered in tense clusters near the grand staircase. Nobody explained anything directly, but Clara understood enough from the atmosphere alone. Something had gone wrong. 20 minutes later, The entire summit delegation was being evacuated by armored train through the Montana wilderness toward a secure government compound outside Helena. The private rail station sat hidden nearly half a mile beneath Black Hollow inside the mountain itself. Steam drifted through the freezing underground platform while black train cars waited beneath industrial floodlights and falling snow. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around herself as security teams loaded documents and luggage onto the train in hurried silence. Nearby, rival Alpha representatives argued quietly with armed escorts while the metallic smell of cold iron filled the air. Through all of it, Rowan Vale remained unervingly calm. He stood near the center of the platform issuing instructions in low measured tones, one gloved hand resting inside the pocket of his black coat. Yet Clara noticed the exhaustion immediately, worse than before. His posture remained controlled, but there was a heaviness in the way he moved now, like someone operating entirely on discipline alone. By the time the train finally pulled away from Black Hollow, midnight had already settled over the mountains. Snow-covered forests blurred beyond the dark windows while the tracks groaned beneath the weight of the armored cars. Most council members gathered inside the larger conference carriage farther ahead, but Rowan remained alone near the rear observation compartment reviewing security updates beneath dim overhead lamps. Clara found him there nearly an hour later. The private carriage felt strangely quiet compared to the rest of the train. Soft amber lighting reflected against polished walnut walls, while snowfall drifted endlessly beyond the windows like pale smoke. Rowan sat beside the glass with several open files scattered across the table before him. But for the first time since she met him, he did not appear fully present. His tie had loosened slightly. Shadows rested heavily beneath his silver eyes. One hand pressed against his temple as though fighting off exhaustion physically hurt. Clara stepped closer slowly. "You should probably stop reading those for 5 minutes." Rowan lowered the report in silence. "There are 6 active territory disputes waiting for resolution by sunrise. And none of them will improve if you collapse first." Something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly across his expression before disappearing again. Clara sat carefully across from him while the train rocked softly through the mountains. Snowlight drifted across Rowan's face in pale silver flashes each time they passed another frozen ridge. Up close, he looked exhausted in a way that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Not weak, just worn down by years of carrying too much alone. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence between them no longer felt sharp now, only tired. Outside, snow raced past the windows beneath the moonlit sky. Finally Clara looked toward him and spoke quietly. "You do not have to stay awake tonight." Rowan's eyes lifted slowly toward hers. For the first time since arriving at Black Hollow, she saw something unguarded move through his expression. Not fear, not suspicion, just exhaustion so deep it almost looked painful. He looked away first. His hand tightened once against the armrest beside him. The train continued deeper into the Montana wilderness, while distant lights disappeared behind snowfall and darkness. Clara remained still beside him, close enough now to hear the uneven rhythm hidden beneath his calm breathing. Rowan blinked slower. Once, then again, as though fighting against something instinctive. The guards stationed outside the carriage pretended not to notice. Nobody spoke. Then slowly, almost carefully, Rowan's shoulders loosened for the first time all night. His head lowered slightly toward her before stopping halfway, like some final hesitation still held him back. Clara did not move away. Seconds later, the weight of his head finally rested against her shoulder. The entire carriage fell completely silent. Clara stopped breathing for a moment. Rowan Vale, the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories, had fallen asleep beside her. Snowlight moved softly across his face while the train carried them through the frozen mountains. He looked younger asleep, less unreachable somehow. One of the guards outside glanced through the glass partition and immediately looked away again in visible disbelief. But Clara barely noticed, because even asleep, Rowan's hand remained clenched tightly against the seat. Beside him, as though some part of him still expected the world to become dangerous again at any moment. And without fully understanding why, Clara found herself wanting to protect the silence around him. By the time the armored train reached Helena just before dawn, rumors had already spread through the entire delegation. Clara felt them immediately the moment she stepped onto the frozen platform beneath pale morning light. Conversations stopped when she passed. Security guards who had barely acknowledged her before now watched her differently, carefully avoiding direct eye contact. Snow drifted softly across the rail yard while black government vehicles waited nearby with engines running beneath clouds of exhaust. Clara tightened her scarf against the cold and pretended not to notice the whispers following behind her. But she noticed something else too. Rowan Vale remained close. Not obviously. Never enough to draw direct attention. Yet every time the delegation moved between buildings, Rowan somehow positioned himself near her without appearing deliberate. If she slowed down, he slowed down. If hostile council members approached, he appeared nearby within seconds. Quiet. Watching. Dangerous in the same restrained way winter storms were dangerous. The secure compound outside Helena looked more military than diplomatic. Concrete buildings sat surrounded by towering fences and armed patrols while helicopters moved overhead through low gray skies. Inside the compound, negotiations resumed immediately beneath harsh fluorescent lighting and endless security briefings. Yet despite the cold institutional setting, Clara could still feel the atmosphere from the train lingering around them. People had seen the king asleep beside her. No one knew what to do with that information. Especially Rowan himself. He barely mentioned the incident afterward. In fact, he became quieter, more controlled. But the changes showed themselves elsewhere instead. During a tense briefing with Idaho representatives, Clara realized Rowan had quietly moved a cup of coffee toward her after noticing she had skipped breakfast. Later, when she nearly slipped on black ice crossing the compound courtyard, his hand appeared instantly at her elbow before she even lost balance. Small things, silent things, yet somehow impossible to ignore now. That afternoon Clara entered one of the side conference rooms carrying revised treaty notes when she overheard voices through the half-open doorway ahead. She recognized Councilman Richard Mercer immediately. "You are becoming a distraction." The words came sharp and low. Clara slowed instinctively before realizing Mercer was not speaking to her. He was speaking to Rowan. Silence followed inside the room for several seconds. Then Mercer continued carefully. "People are watching. They already think your judgment is compromised." Clara remained motionless outside the doorway. Rowan's voice finally answered, calm enough to feel dangerous. "Then perhaps they should focus more on the negotiations than my personal schedule." Mercer exhaled sharply. "You know exactly what I mean." Clara stepped away before either man noticed her standing there. Something uncomfortable settled heavily beneath her ribs afterward. Not fear exactly. Worse. The realization that Rowan's growing protectiveness carried consequences neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. By evening, another storm had moved across Montana. Snow lashed against the compound windows while diplomats gathered inside the lower dining hall for a mandatory security dinner. The room glowed with warm chandelier light reflected against dark wood and polished marble floors, but tension still lingered beneath every conversation. Clara stood near one of the balcony entrances reviewing notes alone when a tall Alpha representative from Nevada approached her with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Miss Bennett." He stepped closer than necessary. "You seem very popular suddenly." Clara offered a polite nod without retreating. "I think people are just bored." "No," the man said softly. "I think people are curious what exactly makes the king lower his guard." The comment tightened something cold in her chest. She shifted slightly toward the open balcony doors, but the man followed casually, blocking part of the exit without touching her. "You should be careful," he continued. "Men like Rowan Vale do not become attached without consequences." Snow blew sharply through the balcony arch behind Clara, carrying freezing air into the room. Then silence shifted beside her. The Alpha representative stopped speaking immediately. Rowan stood there now. No anger showed on his face. Somehow that made the atmosphere worse. He removed his black leather gloves slowly, one finger at a time, silver eyes fixed calmly on the man standing too close to Clara. The entire balcony seemed to still around him. The representative swallowed once before stepping backward without another word. Rowan never looked at him again after that. He simply moved beside Clara, close enough that warmth settled faintly through the cold air between them. Snow drifted beyond the balcony while distant thunder rolled across the mountains outside Helena. Clara looked toward Rowan carefully. "You did not have to do that." Rowan remained silent for a long moment, watching the storm beyond the balcony arches. Then finally, without looking at her, he answered quietly. Yes, he said. I did. The storm over Helena lasted 3 straight days. By the 4th morning, snow covered the government compound in heavy white silence, while freezing wind rattled against the reinforced windows of the main assembly hall. Inside, the atmosphere felt even colder. Clara noticed it immediately the moment she entered beside Rowan. Conversation stopped too quickly. Council members who once ignored her now watched openly from across the chamber. Some curious, some suspicious, some calculating. The train incident had become impossible to bury, and Rowan's behavior afterward had only made the rumors worse. He still remained restrained in public, still spoke carefully, still carried himself with the same controlled authority that made entire territories fear him. But now Clara noticed the details everyone else noticed too. The way his attention followed her movements unconsciously across crowded rooms. The way security staff quietly repositioned themselves whenever she entered a hallway alone. The way Rowan always seemed to know when someone made her uncomfortable before she said a word. Small things, quiet things, but impossible to miss once seen. That morning's royal assembly was held inside the compound's ceremonial chamber beneath towering iron beams and stained glass windows darkened by snowfall outside. Representatives from every Alpha territory sat along curved marble rows facing the elevated throne platform where Rowan presided over final negotiation votes. Clara remained near the lower records table organizing treaty revisions while dozens of voices argued across the chamber. Then Councilman Victor Ashford stood slowly from the western delegation row. The room quieted immediately. Clara recognized him by reputation alone. Intelligent, ruthless, politically dangerous in ways that rarely required raised voices. Victor folded both hands behind his back before speaking toward Rowan directly. Before these negotiations continue, he said smoothly, I believe certain concerns regarding compromised leadership should be addressed openly. Clara felt tension ripple instantly through the chamber. Rowan's expression did not change. Clarify your concern. Victor's eyes shifted toward Clara without subtlety. Your growing attachment to Miss Bennet has become increasingly visible to this council. Murmurs spread softly through the room. Clara remained perfectly still beside the records table while heat crept slowly into her chest. Victor continued calmly. Security decisions have already been altered around her presence. Delegates are beginning to question whether emotional involvement is interfering with political judgment. The silence afterward felt enormous. Clara could feel dozens of eyes settling onto her from every direction now. Some sympathetic. Most not. She looked toward Rowan instinctively. The entire chamber seemed to expect the same thing. Distance. Denial. Political correction. Rowan remained seated for several long seconds beneath the dim winter light filtering through stained glass overhead. His silver eyes stayed fixed on Victor Ashford with unreadable calm. Then slowly Rowan stood. The room quieted completely beneath the movement alone. Clara felt her pulse stumble unexpectedly as he stepped down from the elevated throne platform instead of answering immediately. Heavy silence followed every step across the marble floor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Rowan walked directly toward her. Not hurried. Not angry. Certain. Victor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly for the first time. Clara stopped breathing when Rowan reached her side. He removed the black royal cloak from his shoulders in one slow motion before draping it carefully around her. Warmth settled instantly against her skin beneath the heavy wool and silver-lined fabric. A queen's gesture. The realization moved visibly through the chamber like a shockwave. Rowan finally turned toward Victor then, his voice calm enough to freeze the room entirely. No one speaks to her that way again. The silence afterward felt almost physical. Nobody challenged him. Nobody even looked directly at Clara now, because the meaning behind the gesture had already become unmistakable. Rowan had chosen a side publicly, and everyone in the chamber understood the consequences of that decision immediately. Clara looked up at him slowly, heart unsteady beneath the heavy warmth of his cloak. Rowan never glanced toward her. His attention remained fixed coldly across the assembly hall, while snowfall drifted behind the stained glass windows. Yet standing beside him now, Clara suddenly realized something far more dangerous than the rumors spreading through the council. Rowan was no longer protecting her quietly. He had stopped hiding it completely. Hours later, after the assembly finally ended beneath stunned silence and unfinished political tension, Clara stood alone near one of the compound's upper corridors overlooking the snowy courtyard below. Rowan's cloak still rested around her shoulders. She should have returned it already. Instead, she found herself gripping the dark fabric tighter against the cold. Footsteps approached softly behind her. Rowan stopped beside the window without speaking. Snow moved endlessly beyond the glass beneath the darkening Montana sky. Clara stared outward for several seconds before finally asking quietly, "Do you understand what everyone in that room believes now?" Rowan's reflection remained steady in the window beside hers. "Yes. And that does not concern you." At last, Rowan turned slightly toward her. His silver eyes looked more exhausted than afraid. "It concerns me," he said softly. Then, after a pause that felt far too personal in the silence between them, he added, "What concerns me more is that you looked alone when they spoke about you." The storm over Helena finally broke sometime after midnight, leaving the government compound wrapped in a strange silver stillness beneath fresh snowfall and moonlight. Clara slept badly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rowan stepping down from the throne platform again, felt the heavy warmth of his cloak settling around her shoulders in front of the entire council chamber. By morning, the atmosphere inside the compound had shifted completely. Nobody questioned it openly. That almost made it worse. Conversations stopped when Clara entered rooms now. Security teams straightened subtly whenever Rowan appeared nearby. Even the kitchen staff lowered their eyes with careful respect when she passed through the lower corridors for coffee before dawn. The rumors were no longer rumors anymore. The king had chosen to stand beside her publicly, and everyone understood what that meant politically, even if Clara herself still struggled to understand what it meant emotionally. Snowlight poured pale and cold through the stained glass windows of the assembly hall that morning while council representatives gathered for another emergency session. Rowan sat upon the elevated platform beneath the black crest of the Northern Territories, dressed entirely in dark charcoal and silver beneath the muted chandelier light. From across the chamber, he looked untouchable again. Controlled. Remote. Yet Clara noticed the smallest details now that no one else seemed able to see. The faint exhaustion beneath his eyes. The way his fingers tightened once against the armrest whenever discussions became tense. The almost imperceptible pause before he answered questions requiring political sacrifice. He carried power like armor. Heavy enough to survive in. Heavy enough to drown beneath. Midway through the negotiations, Victor Ashford rose from his seat again. The room immediately quieted beneath the scrape of his chair against marble flooring. Clara felt tension move through the chamber before he even spoke. "There is still the matter of compromised leadership," Victor said calmly, addressing the council instead of Rowan this time. "Several territories have expressed concern that emotional favoritism is now influencing summit security decisions." Nobody interrupted him. Snow drifted softly beyond the stained glass while silence settled heavier across the hall. Victor's gaze shifted toward Clara deliberately. Miss Bennet was a civilian consultant less than a week ago, yet she now receives royal-level protection privileges and direct proximity access unavailable, even to senior council members. Clara felt every eye in the room turn toward her again. Some curious, some hostile, some almost sympathetic. The pressure of it tightened painfully across her chest. Rowan remained silent atop the throne platform for several long seconds. Too long. Clara wondered suddenly if this was the moment he would finally retreat politically. Create distance. Correct the situation before it damaged the negotiations beyond repair. Victor folded his hands behind his back. Perhaps the council deserves clarification regarding the exact nature of the king's attachment. The words landed softly. Cruelly. Clara lowered her eyes briefly toward the polished marble floor, fighting the sudden humiliating awareness of how alone she looked standing there beneath the scrutiny of an entire room. Then movement broke the silence. Rowan stood. Slowly. Deliberately. The atmosphere changed instantly. Nobody breathed loudly anymore. Nobody shifted in their seats. Rowan descended from the elevated platform without speaking, black coat moving softly behind him as he crossed the chamber floor beneath cold winter light. Clara looked up instinctively as he approached. Every heartbeat inside the hall seemed suspended around the sound of his footsteps. He stopped directly beside her, close enough that warmth brushed faintly against the cold air surrounding her. Then Rowan removed the black royal cloak from his shoulders once again and placed it carefully around her before the entire assembly. The silver lining caught the chandelier light like snowfall. A queen's gesture. The realization rippled visibly through the chamber. Victor Ashford's expression tightened for the first time. Rowan finally turned toward him then, silver eyes calm enough to feel dangerous. No one speaks to her that way again. His voice never rose. It did not need to. Silence crushed the room afterward. Absolute and immediate. Nobody challenged him. Nobody even looked directly at Clara anymore. Rowan had answered the question without denial, without apology, without fear. The negotiations ended less than 20 minutes later beneath suffocating political tension. By evening, snow had begun falling again outside the compound. Clara stood alone near one of the upper observation windows overlooking the frozen courtyard below, Rowan's cloak still wrapped around her shoulders. She should have returned it hours ago. Yet somehow she could not bring herself to remove it. Footsteps approached softly behind her. Rowan stopped beside the window without speaking. The reflection of snowfall moved across the glass between them. Clara stared outward for several seconds before finally asking quietly, "Do you regret it?" Rowan looked at her reflection instead of the storm outside. "Protecting you?" His voice lowered almost imperceptibly. No, something inside Clara's chest shifted painfully beneath the answer. Rowan's gaze lingered on her for one suspended moment longer before distant alarms suddenly echoed through the lower compound floors below them. Both of them turned toward the sound instantly as security lights flashed red across the snow-covered courtyard beneath the dark Montana sky. The alarms stopped as suddenly as they had started. Red emergency lights continued flashing faintly across the Helena compound, while armed security teams moved quickly through the lower courtyard beneath falling snow. Clara stood beside the observation window with Rowan only inches away now, both of them listening carefully to distant radio chatter echoing through the corridors outside. One of Rowan's guards finally appeared at the doorway moments later, breathing lightly from the stairs. "Minor perimeter breach," he reported. "No confirmed threat inside the compound. Power systems may become unstable during the storm." Rowan gave a short nod. "Double exterior patrols." The guard hesitated briefly before glancing once toward Clara and the royal cloak around her shoulders. Then he disappeared again into the hallway. Snow continued falling harder outside. Thick, quiet, endless. Rowan remained still beside the window for several long seconds after the door closed. Then finally he looked toward Clara. "The observatory tower still has independent backup power." His voice lowered slightly. "It is quieter there." 30 minutes later they crossed the upper compound grounds beneath heavy snowfall and freezing wind. Clara held the collar of Rowan's cloak tightly against the cold, while security lights flickered faintly through the storm below them. The old observatory stood separated from the main compound by a narrow stone walkway buried beneath snowdrifts. Round and narrow beneath the dark sky, the tower looked older than the military buildings surrounding it. Almost forgotten. Rowan opened the heavy iron door himself, allowing Clara inside first. Warmth greeted them immediately. Soft amber light glowed beneath hanging lanterns while ancient astronomy charts covered the curved walls surrounding the circular room. Above them, the massive glass observatory dome revealed swirling snow and moonlight moving across the night sky. The silence inside felt different from the rest of the compound. Softer somehow. Safer. Clara slowly removed her gloves near the small fireplace while Rowan secured the door behind them. Neither of them spoke for several minutes afterward. Wind moved faintly around the tower outside while snow tapped softly against the observatory glass overhead. Rowan stood near one of the telescope windows staring outward into the storm, his broad shoulders heavy with exhaustion beneath the dim lantern light. Clara noticed it immediately again. The fatigue. Worse now than before. "You should sit down," she said quietly. Rowan almost smiled without actually doing it. "You say that often. Because you never listen." This time a faint trace of warmth finally touched his expression before fading again. He crossed slowly toward the fireplace and lowered himself into the chair beside it with visible restraint, like someone unused to allowing himself rest even briefly. Clara sat nearby, close enough to hear the uneven rhythm hidden beneath his breathing. The storm wrapped around the tower in complete isolation. No council members. No guards. No negotiations. Just silence and snowfall. Rowan leaned back slowly against the chair, eyes fixed on the firelight. For a long time he said nothing at all. Then quietly, almost like the words surprised even him, he spoke into the silence. "If I sleep," his voice roughened slightly, "I see him die again." Clara looked toward him carefully but did not interrupt. Rowan's jaw tightened once beneath the lantern glow. "My brother." The words came softer now, older somehow. During the Cascade Territory War, snow drifted across the observatory glass overhead while firelight moved gently across his face. "I could not reach him in time." He stopped speaking abruptly after that. Silence settled heavily between them again. Clara realized suddenly that this was the first truly personal thing Rowan had ever given her willingly. Not strategy, not politics. Pain. Raw and unfinished beneath years of control. She did not move closer immediately, did not force comfort into the silence. Instead she simply remained there beside him while snow covered the tower outside, and the fire crackled softly between them. Eventually Rowan's breathing slowed. The exhaustion he had been fighting for days finally began pulling him under again. Clara watched him carefully as his eyes lowered shut near the fireplace. For the first time since meeting him, he no longer looked like a king carrying entire territories across his shoulders. Just a tired man who had forgotten what peace felt like. Minutes passed quietly. Then carefully, almost hesitantly, Clara reached beneath the blanket draped across the side of his chair and touched his hand. Rowan's fingers tightened around hers instantly. Instinctively. Even half asleep he held on. Clara's breath caught softly in the silence. Rowan never opened his eyes. But he did not let go either. Outside the observatory dome, snow spiraled endlessly across the dark Montana sky while Clara sat beside the sleeping Alpha King with his hand wrapped tightly around hers, suddenly realizing there might already be no safe way back from whatever was happening between them. Snow fell softly across Helena on the morning of the sacred bond ceremony. By dawn, the entire royal compound had transformed beneath layers of white and silver, the ceremonial hall glowing warmly against the winter darkness like something ancient waiting beneath the storm. Clara stood alone near the preparation chamber windows while servants adjusted the final candles lining the cathedral-length corridor outside. Her pulse had not settled once since the night inside the observatory tower. Rowan's hand around hers. The quiet exhaustion in his voice when he spoke about his brother. The way he had held on to her even in sleep, as though some broken part of him finally believed it was safe to rest. Outside the chamber, distant bells echoed across the compound grounds while members of the royal council filled the ceremonial hall beneath black banners and silver torchlight. Clara looked down at the dark royal cloak folded carefully across her arms. His cloak. The same one he had wrapped around her shoulders before the entire kingdom. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. One of the older council women stepped carefully inside. "The hall is ready," she said softly. Then after a pause, her expression gentled slightly. "The king has not slept at all." Clara's chest tightened unexpectedly. Minutes later, the massive ceremonial doors opened before her. Warm candlelight flooded across polished black marble, while snowfall drifted through the open cathedral arches high above the royal hall. Hundreds of council members, guards, diplomats, and territory leaders stood in complete silence beneath towering iron chandeliers as Clara walked slowly forward alone. At the far end of the hall, Rowan Vale waited beneath the ancient crest of the Northern Territories. Black suit, silver ceremonial sash, motionless beneath the falling snowlight. Yet Clara noticed immediately what no one else would ever see. He looked nervous. Not frightened. Not uncertain. Just emotionally exposed in a way power had clearly never allowed him before. An elderly council elder leaned quietly toward another representative near the front row. Clara heard the whisper as she passed. "The king has never trusted anyone this much." The words settled heavily inside her chest. Rowan's silver eyes never left her as she reached the center of the ceremonial platform. Ancient candle flames flickered softly around them while the hall remained completely silent. The officiant stepped forward slowly holding the ceremonial silver binding cord between both hands. The sacred bond recognizes not dominance, the older man said calmly, but chosen peace. Clara's breath caught softly at the words. Rowan stood only inches away now beneath drifting snowfall, close enough for her to see the exhaustion still lingering beneath his eyes, close enough to realize he was holding himself together entirely through restraint. The officiant lowered his voice. Speak the ancient bond words if this bond is freely chosen. Silence filled the hall. Clara looked up at Rowan fully then. Not the feared Alpha King. Not the ruler everyone obeyed. Just the man who had not slept peacefully in years until his head rested against her shoulder. The man who noticed when she skipped meals. The man who carried entire territories alone while quietly protecting her at every turn. Clara stepped closer. Then softly, steadily, she spoke the ancient words into the silence between them. Your burden will not be carried alone anymore. Rowan's expression broke for the first time since she met him. Not dramatically. Worse. His composure simply slipped beneath the weight of emotion he could no longer fully hide. His jaw tightened once. Silver eyes lowered briefly as though steadying himself against something overwhelming. The entire hall remained frozen watching him. Rowan finally lifted his gaze back to hers. His voice came quieter than she had ever heard it. Stay. Just one word. Yet it carried every sleepless night, every unspoken fear, every silent moment beside her. Clara nodded before the council, before the kingdom, before the storm itself. I will. The sacred bond ceremony began immediately afterward. The silver binding cord wrapped around both their joined hands while candlelight flickered across the ceremonial platform and snowfall drifted softly through the open arches overhead. The royal council lowered their heads together in recognition as the ancient vow completed. Not forced. Chosen. Rowan never released Clara's hand once. When the ceremony ended, tradition demanded the Alpha King ascend alone to the elevated throne platform overlooking the hall. Instead, Rowan stepped down from it completely. A ripple of stunned silence moved through the chamber. Then slowly, deliberately, Rowan lowered himself to one knee before Clara in front of the entire kingdom. Gasps echoed softly through the hall. Rowan pressed his forehead gently against hers beneath the snowfall. You are safe with me, he whispered. Clara closed her eyes briefly as emotion tightened painfully through her chest. Then she touched her forehead back against his without hesitation. The hall remained utterly silent around them. Not fearful now. Reverent. Rowan finally stood and intertwined his fingers with hers before turning toward the kingdom still watching from beneath torchlight and snow. But instead of reclaiming the throne alone, he guided Clara beside him as they walked together through the ceremonial hall beneath the ancient banners of the northern territories. Outside, winter storms still moved across the mountains. Politics would continue. Conflicts would remain. Yet for the first time in years, Rowan Vale no longer carried the weight of his kingdom alone. And as snow drifted endlessly beyond the royal arches, the most feared Alpha alive finally looked at peace.